A family faces open water with no boat, map, or return policy. So how did Africans eventually reach nearly every habitable corner of Earth? The obvious answer is one heroic migration, like history's longest group hike. Except it happened in many waves, and several early journeys apparently failed. The successful spread was less a march than generations repeatedly choosing the next livable horizon. But our species was not the first human relative to leave Africa. Hominins reached Dmanisi in Georgia roughly 1.8 million years ago, astonishingly early. Nobody announced departure, groups followed water, prey, plants, and opportunities beyond familiar ground. Move a few miles each generation, and eventually your descendants are embarrassingly far from home. When rainfall shifted, edible landscapes and the animals living in them shifted too. Sometimes human expansion probably looked less like exploration and more like following dinner. Fire, flexible tools, and cooperation made unfamiliar places slightly less committed to killing you. Most individuals stayed fairly local. The species moved because countless local ranges slowly overlapped. We call it migration because nobody preserved the ordinary Tuesdays between the famous endpoints. Wet periods opened green corridors. Dry periods broke them into dangerous islands of habitat. Northeastern Africa led toward the Levant, while the southern Red Sea offered another possible gate. To understand the later expansion, first ask what Homo sapiens had become inside Africa. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, but not at one cinematic birthplace. There was no identifiable first couple stepping from a cave with matching species certificates. Fossils from Morocco are about 315,000 years old. Ethiopian remains exceed 230,000. The evidence fits populations that separated, reconnected, and exchanged genes across long spans of time. Africa is enormous, ecologically varied, and spectacularly unhelpful to any single birthplace cartoon. During humid phases, rivers and grasslands connected communities that dry phases later isolated. People exchanged mates, tools, food knowledge, and probably stories whenever networks reconnected. Modern human anatomy and behavior accumulated through a long, uneven process, not one upgrade. Human genetic diversity remains greatest within Africa, reflecting far deeper population history there. Remaining in Africa was not humanity buffering. It was almost all of our species' early history. Communities learned coastlines, forests, grasslands, highlands, and increasingly arid country across Africa. Research suggests human habitat breadth expanded sharply inside Africa, beginning around 70,000 years ago. Travellers carried learned flexibility, social connections, and practical knowledge, not a magical new brain. Yet capable sapiens had already crossed outward, and most early lineages seemingly vanished. What happened? A jaw from Israel's Mislia cave places Homo sapiens outside Africa around 177,000 to 194,000 years ago. People also lived at School and Kafse in the Levant, roughly 90,000 to 130,000 years ago. Stone tools, footprints, and lake deposits show repeated human movement through a periodically green Arabia. Many ancient coasts now lie underwater, while heat, acid soils, and erosion erased remains elsewhere. Early groups may have been too small and isolated to maintain populations through worsening conditions. A greener corridor could become desert again within generations, cutting settlers from reinforcements. Competition, disease, demographic bad luck, or absorption into other populations could erase a lineage. They were not foolish pioneers. survival can fail even when every decision looks reasonable. Some early dispersals may have contributed faint ancestry, but their exact legacy remains debated. One route crossed northeastern Africa into Sinai and the Levant during favourable environmental windows. Another possible route crossed near the Red Sea's southern end, though details remain uncertain. Lower sea level narrowed the Red Sea, but inconveniently did not turn it into a sidewalk. The coast was not a conveyor belt. Travellers still needed fresh water, food, shelter, and luck. So what changed around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago that made one expansion endure? Probably not one invention, sudden genius gene, or prehistoric software update. By around 70,000 years ago, African populations were using a much wider range of habitats. Different groups mastered deserts, forests, coasts and grasslands, while exchanging useful ideas. Water storage, broader diets, controlled burning, and flexible tools reduced dependence on one perfect ecosystem. Larger social networks stored information across people, which is cloud backup without electricity. If one expert died, connected communities could relearn skills instead of losing them permanently. Expansion usually meant seasonal camps shifting, scouting nearby water. Then families following proven ground. Nobody needed to plant a flag. Finding tomorrow's breakfast was sufficiently motivational. Climate repeatedly opened patches of connected habitat across northeastern Africa and southwestern Asia. Some families followed improving land, others left shrinking resources. There was no single evacuation order. Most non-African ancestry traces to a comparatively small population that expanded beyond Africa. That genetic bottleneck estimates breeding ancestry, not the passenger count on one extremely delayed bus. Genetic estimates overlap broadly, so 70,000, 60,000 and 50,000 years are ranges, not appointments. One model places a long-lived population hub around the Persian Plateau before wider Eurasian expansion. But the land beyond Africa was occupied. Who did these newcomers meet? Neanderthals had lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans are known from very few remains, yet their DNA reveals a wide Asian presence. Other human relatives survived farther east, though direct encounters with sapiens are often unproven. We cannot reconstruct every meeting, but genetics proves at least some became intensely personal. Most people with primarily non-African ancestry carry roughly 2% Neanderthal-derived DNA. Subscribe, unlike ancient DNA, this trail should not disappear without leaving descendants. Ancient genomes date the main shared Neanderthal admixture event to roughly 45,000 49,000 years ago. Recombination chops inherited Neanderthal segments shorter each generation, turning fragment length into a clock. This was not one tidy peace summit. Contact likely happened repeatedly across shifting frontiers. Some early Europeans had Neanderthal ancestors only a few generations back, according to their genomes. Denisovan ancestry is especially high in Papuans and some indigenous Philippine populations, reflecting multiple contacts. Some archaic variants later aided immunity or high-altitude living, although most inherited DNA was neutral or removed. Human history resembles branches that repeatedly reconnect, making every clean family tree suspiciously optimistic. Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared as distinct populations, while pieces of them continued inside others. By the time sapiens spread widely across Eurasia, the travellers were already genetically mixed. Once established in Asia, how quickly could people reach the far Eastern Ocean? Populations moved through southern and central Asia, along many rivers, coasts, forests, and interior corridors. The southern route was not one uninterrupted beach sprint with complementary coconuts. Sites in Laos and Sumatra indicate sapiens there roughly 86,000 to 63,000 years ago. How those early Asians relate to later populations remains debated because fossils and genomes preserve different stories. Tropical heat and acidic soil destroy bone quickly, leaving archaeology with a severe evidence allergy. Lower sea levels joined much of western Indonesia to mainland Southeast Asia as the landmass Sunda. Farther east, deep channels preserved islands, making water crossings unavoidable through Wallacea. Models suggest settling Sahul required repeated, coordinated voyages, not one family drifting accidentally. Their boats vanished because wood biodegrades, an inconsiderate habit shared by most prehistoric technology. Travellers could read currents, birds, clouds, smoke, and island silhouettes without seeing the final destination. Australia and New Guinea formed one larger Ice Age landmass called Sahul, though oceans still guarded it. Evidence supports humans in Sahul by at least 50,000 years ago, with older estimates near 65,000. A Sulawesi hand stencil, dated to at least 67,800 years, now marks artists along a likely northern route. The first travellers were not merely surviving. They carried symbolic traditions across dangerous seas. Once ashore, populations spread through coasts, savannas, forests, mountains, and arid interiors. Aboriginal Australian and Papuan peoples developed long, changing local histories, not frozen Stone Age snapshots. East was often warm, but the same species soon entered places where winter could kill within hours. By about 45,000 years ago, sapiens populations were expanding widely and persistently across Eurasia. Modern humans were in Europe by at least 45,000 years ago, overlapping with Neanderthals. A roughly 45,000-year-old Siberian genome shows humans already deep inside northern Asia. Cold weather clothing rarely survives, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct fashion from tools and continued breathing. Fire, windbreaks, fitted hides, stored fuel, and calorie-rich food turned lethal cold into manageable cold. Northern survival demanded anticipating winter, before winter personally explained the scheduling problem. Knowing animal routes, safe river crossings, and snow behaviour mattered as much as any tool. Long-distance networks moved mates, raw materials, and information between small, vulnerable camps. Some early Eurasian populations left no later descendants. Successful settlements still included repeated replacement. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population around 40,000 years ago. No single cause explains it. Climate, low population density, competition, and absorption all remain suspects in an unusually cold case. Humans reached far northern Siberia by roughly 32,000 years ago, despite brutal seasonal darkness. At Yana, people built lives in mammoth country, where even the groceries could outweigh the neighbourhood. Lower seas exposed Beringia, a broad region connecting Siberia and Alaska, not a narrow bridge. Land connected Asia to America, but giant ice sheets made the next doorway brutally complicated. Beringia was a cold grassland homeland where populations could live for generations, not merely cross. Some ancestors may have remained there for millennia, history's least comfortable airport layover. Movement south may have used the Pacific coast, an interior corridor, or different routes at different times. Securely dated sites place people south of the Great Ice Sheets, roughly 16,000 to 14,500 years ago. White Sands footprints may be 21,000 to 23,000 years old, supported by several dating methods. Their age has survived major tests, although scientists still examine the sediments and assumptions closely. If those dates hold, people entered much earlier than the old Clovis first story allowed. The best coastal camps may now sit underwater, because sea level rise is terrible archival policy. Boats and marine foods could support a Pacific route, but no preserved itinerary settles the question. By at least 14 to 600 years ago, people lived at Monteverde in southern Chile. Again, no one crossed two continents personally. Small generational movements produced enormous collective distance. Communities adapted from Arctic tundra to deserts, high mountains, grasslands, and tropical forests. The Americas were never one population. Groups divided, reunited, diversified, and moved again. Later migrations reshaped the Arctic and other regions, adding new branches to an older foundation. Even after every continent held people, thousands of islands still waited beyond open ocean. Remote islands required intentional voyaging, reliable vessels, supplies, navigation, and enough settlers to build communities. The crossings into Sahul proved deep maritime ability. Later societies expanded it across larger oceans. Austronesian-speaking communities expanded from Taiwan into island Southeast Asia around 4,000 years ago. They carried crops, animals, pottery and boat knowledge, an entire village starter kit. New arrivals mixed with Papuan-related communities, creating layered ancestries rather than simple replacement. By about 3,000 years ago, Lapita communities were moving east into remote Oceania. Navigators read stars, swells, winds, birds and memory, despite receiving zero satellite assistance. Over centuries, voyagers settled the enormous Polynesian triangle from Hawaii to Rapa Nui and Aotearoa. Aotearoa, New Zealand was settled around 1250 to 1300 CE, a remarkably late human arrival. We reached the last major shores. So was global expansion really one triumphal march? No. It was repeated departure, failure, survival, mixing, isolation, replacement, and return. Most individuals never left a continent. Descendants expanded because ordinary families moved short distances. Africa remained humanity's deepest reservoir of diversity, innovation, and continuous movement throughout the story. The pattern never stopped. People still move when safety, work, climate, or family pulls them elsewhere. Every population became both local and connected. Genetic purity is a story, not human history. Modern borders are newcomers standing across paths humans had already walked for thousands of generations. Humanity filled the world not by knowing the destination, but by repeatedly making unfamiliar places home.